My name is Jeremy Petranka, and I'm currently an assistant dean at the Fuqua School of Business at Duke University. So with the COVID-19 pandemic causing so much disruption in so many people's lives, I've actually been heartened by how much mental health has been talked about by the press in the last month or two, that for someone for whom mental health is just a huge part of my life, I have some idea of how challenging these times have been for a lot of people. And I was talking to a colleague about this, and she said something that really resonated with me. She said that for a lot of people that might be suffering for the first time, they might not even know what mental health looks like. And it got me thinking back to my own path and when I first started and all the questions that I had surrounding mental health. Things like, what does wellness even mean? Things like, what happens when you go to therapy? And I realized there might be a lot of people out there right now that have the same questions and don't have anyone in their lives that are able to answer those questions or that they feel comfortable asking. So what we wanted to do is put together a longer form Q&A that really dives into those questions that I had when I first started for any of you that might be suffering right now and kind of thinking about your own mental health for the first time. So luckily, I have a colleague and friend that is able to answer those questions. So Dr. Emily Brucia, it's hard to overstate her accomplishments, but I'm going to give you some of the highlights. So she is a clinical psychologist. She has a PhD. She's worked across private sector. She worked across public sector. She handles multiple psychiatric diagnoses, but she has a particular focus on trauma and PTSD. She's worked in her career with a lot of veterans, a lot of first responders. She is the vice president of the First Responder Support Network. And because she doesn't have enough on her plate, she is also the founder and CEO of Elemental Telehealth, which is designed to offer really holistic, high-quality psychiatric help that evidence-based and across a lot of different diagnoses. So the kind of catch to that is that she actually launched 4 days before we recorded this interview, which just makes me want to thank you even more for taking the time to do this. I can't tell you how much I appreciate it.
Sure. Thank you so much, Jeremy. It really is such a pleasure to be here. And I was just very honored that you asked me to be a part of this.
All right. So here's the name of the game that we're aiming for. And Emily and I are both in on this. Is I have a list of questions that I would have found useful at some point, but I also happen to get curious and go down tangents, so that may or may not happen. But the goal is that today we want to talk about kind of the individual level mental health, and really catered for people that either maybe haven't really understood how mental health affects them, or just hitting this new normal that we're in. And maybe they're finding that, they're more fearful, they're more anxious, they're more depressed, they're more tired. Just kind of help get an understanding of that. So that's kind of the goal today. And then we're hoping to do another one where we talk about more relationships, how this manifests itself in relationships, especially in the current times, how we can help each other, both in the personal and in the workplace. That's kind of what we're aiming for. So if you're good with jumping in, first thing that I want to do before we talk about some of the COVID-19 specifics is just talking about kind of a general overview of mental health, especially for people that, again, have never really dug into this. So if possible, maybe it is, maybe it isn't, could you give your kind of 10,000 foot view on what we mean when we're actually talking about mental health?
Sure. Yeah. And even to zoom all the way out and just look at it from a whole health perspective, I really love the World Health Organization definition of health, which is a complete state of physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And I really like that approach to thinking about health, big picture, because it means that it's not just that you aren't sick, it actually means that you are living a full life, a vibrant life, a high quality of life. And so then if we zoom in a little bit closer and talk about specifically mental health, well, then in that case, we're zooming in on that mental piece. So we're looking at cognitions, we are looking at, which are thoughts, we're looking at emotions, and we're looking at behaviors, as well as relationships. And so when we talk about what is mental health, those are some of the key pieces that we're looking at and evaluating as we're helping folks decide whether or not they might be in need of treatment or additional support to help them through whatever it is that they're going through.
All right, time for me to go off the rails. So
Yeah.
that didn't take long. When you said cognition, when you said thoughts, I think I know what you mean. Just having looked into mental health for a while.
Sure.
For people that haven't, like, what do you mean when you're actually talking about thoughts and cognition in that way?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it kind of depends. I mean, I'm trained to think about things from a diagnostic perspective, but if I'm just talking broadly speaking, the thoughts are, right, we all have this internal dialogue that's constantly going through our head. And depending on who you are, that dialogue might be very kind and loving. It also might be really harsh and critical. And I see you laughing over there.
Do go on.
Right. Might be harsh and critical, might be a combination of both, of course. And then depending on who you are and the particular experiences that you're having, if we think about something like psychotic disorders, then someone may be experiencing thoughts that are not actually being generated by it is being generated by their brain, but it's being perceived as something that's coming in from the outside world. And that can be, of course, extremely distressing.
So I think that piece you said, that I think a lot of people that haven't really looked into this, especially if you just kind of watch the movies and think about what mental health looks like, I think a lot of people do think in kind of this binary, there's a psychotic break, this idea of, they're suddenly in a world that's not there. But most of what you said isn't that. Most of what you said sounds like it's basically just people thinking, feeling. Is it that we're normally talking about, especially when we tell people that they should focus on mental health, is it normally these big things we're talking about, or normally just, no, this is just how brains work?
I think it's a mixture, quite honestly, because at the end of the day, and this is a phrase that has become more popular, I think, in the last year or two, that we all have mental health, every single one of us. And so doing the things that you need to do to really support your mental health is important. So yeah, I don't know if that fully answers your question. I mean, I guess what I'm also thinking about too is that there are some psychiatric diagnoses that do have what we might think of as more of an abrupt onset. Psychotic disorders can be this way, although often in hindsight, you can actually look back and see more of a slow onset. It just wasn't being identified early on, which also speaks to the importance of early intervention and proactive intervention. But oftentimes for folks, I mean, I was just seeing a patient recently who was describing that it wasn't until 10 years down the line that he actually started to realize, wow, my life is being really impacted by this. And that was only after he started getting feedback from some family members that they were concerned about him. So oftentimes I think when we're talking about mental health or mental health issues, it can be a slow, insidious onset, although I'm thinking about our current circumstances in COVID-19. Of course, this is a pretty abrupt, significant stressor that's coming with, can come with quite a lot of distress depending on your current situation.
And I think that, I think just knowing that really helps people as they think about this. That for me, anxiety is the thing that kind of I always struggle with. And it was the more insidious one. It was, looking back, it's, of course. But little by little, it just kind of progressed. And, anxiety is just a natural human reaction. It's a natural human emotion. There's nothing inherently bad with anxiety. I'm about to get eaten by a bear. I should be anxious and I should run away, right? But it's that idea that no, it's all of it together. But then there's also some very big things that can hit. I think that's really helpful for people to realize is kind of a menu of what we're talking about here. Yes.
And I really appreciate that point that you're making too about how our emotions and our thoughts serve important purposes. And so if you are, exactly as you were saying, if you're about ready to get eaten by a bear, then your emotions are serving a very important purpose in helping you survive. And so I think that's the really important point to remember too, is that when there is a real threat, in the case of anxiety, that your body is functioning exactly as it should be. It's what happens on the back end of things. Are you continuing to stay very anxious even after the bear is long gone?
So kind of digging in more into it can be a big thing, but it can also just be our everyday. Do you do you, especially with your training, do you see a difference between, say, someone feeling bad because they've worn sweats all day, watching movies all day, eating a bunch of chips, haven't really gone outside at all, feeling bad because of that versus feeling bad because of a mental health issue? Are they related? Are they one and the same? Like as people are kind of trying to understand this within the context of their lives, where does one start and the other end?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think, the short answer is that I think they both can certainly go hand in hand. And, of course, I have days where I hang out and watch TV and stay in my PJs and...
There was no judgment there, by the way. No judgment.
I eat more junk food than I should. And I'm still, at least as far as I know, I'm still fulfilling my other responsibilities. Having days like that here and there doesn't cause me a particular amount of distress. In fact, I quite like those days every now and then. So really, when we're thinking about mental health issues, we're thinking more about, is the person being distressed by the experience that they're having? And is that experience that they're having contributing to impairment in different areas of their life? So with the actual distress, then if we really start to dig in, we're looking at how frequently are these experiences happening? How intense are they for you? And then also, what's the level of impairment? Is it that you are calling in sick from work once a week? Is it that you're unable to work at all? Or is it that, hey, you just had a pretty big stressor and you're taking some time to recoup and take care of yourself? And sometimes that just means hanging out at home and not really doing anything.
And I know in my case that just to kind of paint a story for people, and I think with anxiety, it's one that because everyone can kind of relate to. I think that's the point that I realized I needed help, is how it was affecting me. Is I'll basically always be replaying events in my head and always be causing that anxiety to hit. Where looking back, I see now what that impairment was, but in the time it was just, that's just what my brain is doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, hindsight is 20/20.
Right. So with that, for people that this is the first time, maybe they thought about mental health issues. Maybe this is the first time they're thinking, that might have a name for it. Just at a high level, what should people kind of be looking for to see if they might want to start getting help, maybe from a therapist or maybe just doing things that we know help mental health, which we'll talk about later.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think there are a variety of different things that someone can look at. I mean, again, kind of going back to what I just shared around, are you having experiences that are causing you distress? Are you unable to fall asleep at night because your mind is running 1,000,000 miles a minute? One of the ways that I like to break it down for myself, because it helps me stay more organized when we're actually thinking about mental health issues and how someone can have a check-in with themselves, is looking at, okay, what are the thoughts that I'm having on kind of a typical day? Are my thoughts, am I worrying all the time? Am I feeling concerned about, losing my job or something bad happening to a family member or a loved one? Are my thoughts really down and just doom and gloom? We might, again, see more of that with those what we think of as depressive-genic cognitions. So what are the thoughts that you're having? And then how are the thoughts impacting your mood? So how are your emotions doing? Are you feeling anxious? Are you feeling down? Are you feeling irritable, angry, exhausted, fatigued? So thoughts, feelings, behaviors. Are you unable to fall asleep at night? Are you tossing and turning? Are you using substances as a way to cope? So we tend to see more alcohol use when people are under a significant amount of stress. And then zooming out a level from just the individual, what's happening relationally? How are your relationships with your family members and your friends being impacted? Are you socializing like you used to? Are you finding that you're zoning out on your phone more than you used to when you're at work, or you're locking yourself in your office? At work, how are things going? So you can kind of just see, I mean, if you can start on that individual micro level, and then you just keep zooming out to look at all the different areas of your life, and then big picture, functionally, what's happening? Are you able to go to the grocery store? Are you able to get out of bed and get dressed and take a shower in the morning and those kinds of things?
So I keep laughing because I wish I had this checklist
I
years ago.
know.
If you were going through, I'm like, oh yeah, no, that fits, that fits. All right, so before we kind of get into what a lot of people I think are dealing with on the coronavirus, and a lot of this came from just talking with you and me getting a better understanding of some of the nuances. Imagine that someone's watching this and they're thinking, oh, maybe there has been a change in behavior. I am having trouble sleeping. My relationships at home are a bit strained. And let's say they do decide to go see a therapist and they never have before. One of the things again I want to do is just ask the questions that I wish I could have asked back in the day.
Sure.
Literally the process of finding a therapist. Could you walk through your understanding of that? Being
Yes.
a therapist.
Yes, this is. Well, first of all, even before answering that question, what I just want to dovetail off of and add on to is that for folks who are experiencing difficulty sleeping right now, or they're feeling more amped up and worried than they ever have before, or they're feeling down and they just can't concentrate, these are all very common stress reactions, and we are certainly going through an unprecedented time. So given all of that, we don't necessarily know how folks are going to be doing a few weeks down the line, a month down the line, 6 months down the line. But at least right now, given the gravity of the stressors that people are facing, we actually probably wouldn't jump in and be quick to pathologize what's happening. Although I still think there are some, quick and dirty, if you will, tips and tricks and coping strategies that people can use to help them navigate through this time. And sometimes that might include also preemptively reaching out for, professional mental health support from a therapist. Now, as far as your question about actually finding a clinician, I really wish that I had just a straightforward, this is the easiest, most effective way to do it. I get asked this question all the time from family and friends. And what I can say, well, for anyone who's been through the process, they probably already know this, that it can be a very cumbersome, frustrating, and quite frankly, just downright confusing process. It's where do you start? How do you know who to look for? And so the traditional models include, seeking a referral from your primary care doctor, going through your insurance, calling your insurance company up and asking them for a list of providers. There are also websites like psychologytoday.com where you can actually search for a therapist by your zip code. And then of course, word of mouth referrals as well, I think are something that I hear a lot from folks, how they end up finding the clinician who they worked with. Or, if you're a veteran or something like that, going through, the VA, if you're eligible for VA care. What I can say though about all of those processes is that none of them are straightforward. And most of the time they often don't empower patients to actually connect with someone who they feel strongly is the best fit for them. So it's it can kind of be a hit or miss game, which also isn't great for people who are already experiencing distress and just want to quickly connect with someone to provide them with the best care possible. So, again, I wish I had a better solution here. I know that it's something that my company and some other companies that are in the health tech space are really working hard to improve for patients so that people can feel really empowered with the information and knowledge that they need to connect with someone who's a good fit for them.
So there's kind of two things in there that I want to go deeper in. One of them, and I'm so glad you said this, because I know this just with talking with friends, that your first therapist might not be the right therapist. And it's not that you're off the mark, it's not that they're off the mark, it's just that there's different styles or what you need might not exactly fit their approach. Is that right? And then the second part of that, if that is right, how hard is it to break up with a therapist?
Great question. So I can also share from personal experience. So when I was in graduate school, we were required to complete a certain number of therapy hours in our own personal therapy. And so I actually had the experience that you're describing exactly. I reached out to a clinician and met with her. And after that maybe it was the first or second session, I just knew, this isn't feeling right. This isn't gelling. And again, it was someone who I had found pretty randomly. At that time, it was through insurance. And also at the time, I did really struggle to, quote, break up with a clinician because at the end of the day, sometimes it's just not a good fit. So, as a clinician, as a psychologist, what I can at least say that I do with the folks who I work with is have, especially in the beginning, have pretty regular check-ins about how are things going? What do you like about the approach that I'm taking? What do you not like? Is this feeling like a good fit? And really doing what I can to try to create as much safety and space for patients to voice if it's just not feeling right for them. And sometimes that is the case, and we might either kind of radically adjust the clinical work that we're doing, or it might be, okay, you actually want to work on sleep. That's not something that I have the capacity to do right now. However, let me refer you over to someone else. So I think that breaking up with a therapist is not an easy thing to do. And at least from the conversations that I've had with lots of my colleagues, at the end of the day, the chances are extremely high that the person who you're working with wants the very best for you and would also really welcome that feedback about, hey, it just doesn't feel like a good fit. Because more than anything, I think we get really concerned when people just disappear and we don't know what's going on. Are they okay? Was it something about us? And so, at least on, I can't speak for everyone, of course, but at least on my end, when I'm working with folks, I really try to incorporate ongoing feedback about how it's going so that we can ensure that we're providing the best care.
When you broke up with yours, did it go okay?
I actually didn't feel safe enough, I guess, to quote break up with her. So I ended up completing I think it was 16 hours of therapy, and then later on found someone who was a better fit, who I worked with longer term. So
here's the second question. Again, it's, really for people that have never gone to therapy. And I think the fact that you pointed out, therapy shouldn't necessarily be the first thing to think about. There's so many other things we're going to talk about. But if they do choose to go, can you just give a brief picture of what that first therapy session looks like for someone that's never gone before? I think a lot of people worry that it's going to be, so tell me about your darkest trauma that you've had, or like what does a normal first session feel like?
Yeah, again, great question, because I think there often is a lot of uncertainty, and therapy is something that's so often mysterious. I think the process feels very mysterious, especially for people who have never been through it. And so, again, I can't speak for every clinician, but at least for me, what a first session looks like is, well, I will have met with the person by phone before. So having, a 15-ish minute consultation to get a sense of what are they looking for, what questions do they have for me right out of the gate. And then from there, if it makes sense to go ahead and schedule an initial intake, then what will happen is, I'll send over some paperwork. And this includes, it's asking about a range of different things from, do you have prior mental health treatment? What symptoms are you currently experiencing? What are your goals? What are you hoping to work on? I'll ask about, job and, get some background, family upbringing, who raised you, that kind of stuff. And then by the time the individual comes in for their first appointment, I already have at least a starting point. And so the very first session is typically introductions. I'll share about my background, go over everything from informed consent to the limits of confidentiality, so there's no mysteries there. And then we'll use the information that they provide me with as really a starting point for the conversation. And I think in the beginning, the primary focus is often around, clarifying the diagnostic picture. So what is actually going on with you? And then also figuring out what is it that you really value? What is it that you're hoping to achieve by the end of our work together? And that all then kind of provides the framework and the foundation to collaboratively treatment plan and figure out what treatment and what approach is going to be the best fit for that person. So that's at least what it looks like on my end.
That's what I've observed too on the other side.
Good, okay.
All right, so perfect. So that was, again, just kind of the overview of mental health in general. But one of the reasons I so wanted to talk to you is there's so much specific happening right now with shelter in place, with isolation, with the trauma of people getting sick and having loved ones get sick and in some cases, unfortunately, pass away. That I wanted to dig more into that so some people can get a better understanding of what they might be going through. And there's three major, I think, maybe a little bit idiosyncrasies to what we're dealing with right now. The ones we'll talk about later are the sense of loss and the fear that I think a lot of people are justifiably feeling. But the first one is how fast the change occurred and how it led to significant amounts of isolation that I think weren't there. And so one thing that has been really just kind of startling in its magnitude is that this has affected almost everybody's day-to-day life severely. But one of the interesting things is in some cases, it's a very large effect. So if you lose your job, if you get sick, if you're a first responder, you're talking about these really big, I think in a lot of ways, it's exactly, with the PTSD, that's exactly what you kind of know, what the tools look like. Or people kind of know what the tools, of course you do. But for the other side, I think the one that is I think a lot of people might be missing is it's not one big thing that changed. It's, well, I work from home now instead of the office. Well, the kids are here and instead of there. Well, I have to cook more versus I didn't. It's these series of small changes. And I heard someone describe it and I wanted to get your take on it because it resonated with me, is they said it's effectively a series of small repeated trauma that people are experiencing, and especially with your background in trauma. I wanted to kind of get your feel on whether that seems right and if that's one of the things that's causing so much difficulty.
Yeah, it's a great question. And one thing that I find myself saying all the time in the field of psychology is it depends. So that is really not a straightforward, simple answer, but generally speaking, big picture, it's going to depend on who you are and what your life circumstances are. And that being said, I think that you are spot on in that there are a number of people who are experiencing, and I don't even know that I would necessarily say small traumas. I mean, sometimes we're talking about really people are going through what we think of as big T traumas and little T traumas. So big T traumas are going to be kind of those classic things that we hear about the most when we talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, for example, a car crash, war zone. We think about first responders, healthcare workers, anyone really who's in the hospital system, frontline delivery, grocery folks who are effectively putting their lives and their health on the line, which could absolutely later on, meet criteria for like what we think of it in the diagnostic nomenclature, criterion A traumatic event with regard to at least PTSD. Now, the caveat to that, at least when we're talking about big T traumas, is that the prevalence rate of adults who experience traumatic events in their lifetime ranges from like 37% to 92%. So most people don't get through adulthood and don't get through life without experiencing at least one big T trauma. And that being said, most people go on to have what we would think of as a natural recovery. So the prevalence rate of something like post-traumatic stress disorder is 6.8%. For the general adult population. And on top of that, PTSD isn't even the most common diagnosis following a trauma. Depression and anxiety are actually more commonly diagnosed than PTSD. So PTSD is just like one manifestation of a trauma response. And so then, of course, outside of those more traditional criterion A traumatic events, the big ones, there are those, I don't even like the word little T traumas because they can still be extremely traumatic. And these are things like losses of jobs, other significant losses of life, the loss of life as we all know it right now. I mean, our whole world in different ways, depending on, who you are, everyone, as you were saying, everyone's life has been impacted. So there's also and I think you were kind of alluding to this a little bit earlier, there's a lot of grief mixed into this picture too. David Kessler was just interviewed recently in the Harvard Business Review. There was a great article that came out on, I think the title of it was "That Discomfort You're Feeling is Grief." And I found that article to just kind of brilliantly summarize and capture what I think a lot of folks are experiencing right now, which is loss of life as we know it, loss of rituals that we here in America are used to celebrating, like graduation milestones. I'm thinking about lots of students who won't get to have that typical graduation experience that they always thought they would. So yes, it's a mixture of the big T traumas and the little T traumas, I think, that folks are experiencing.
So with the little T, where it's, it's hard. My feel is a little T would be harder to pinpoint exactly what it is. Like it's a feeling of something's off, but I'm not sure what. And it sounds like the manifestation of that can be different ways, but is anxiety, depression kind of the ones that are going to be most prevalent at this point?
If the past is indicative of what we might expect moving forward, then yes, I wouldn't be surprised if we started to see more anxiety and depression on the other side of this pandemic. Right now, I think everyone is kind of just going through it. And so right now people are just pulling out all the stops that they can to try to cope with what's going on. But yes, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw more depression, more anxiety, and some other kinds of trauma responses as well, like adjustment disorders, and even things like substance use. I'll be curious to see what happens there, since sometimes in times of stress and crisis, people also can lean on alcohol and other substances as a coping mechanism.
What is adjustment disorder? Unless that's a really long question, in which case.
It is a long question, but the short answer to it is adjustment disorder it's a formal psychiatric diagnosis that can be given to someone who's continuing to experience distress related to a significant stressor, even after that stressor has disappeared, so to speak.
So they don't really find a new normal. They just stay. All right, so hitting then as part of this and part of the stressors, I think isolation is one that is definitely going to be play a role. And I know that social interaction is actually one of the important elements to mental health for all sorts of reasons. But from your perspective, what are the effects of just having increased isolation, having less social interaction, and what are some of the risks that we're looking at?
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to be talking about here, because at the end of the day, and there's a ton of research to support this. I mean, we are a species that is biologically hardwired for social connection. I was actually just saying the other day, I was out on an evening stroll with my family, and we saw other groups of people that were starting to mingle very closely together. And one of the thoughts that crossed my mind was, at this point, generally speaking, everyone knows that we should be maintaining physical distance at least 6 feet, and yet that drive for social connection is so strong that even when we cognitively know it up here, we are willing to push the boundaries of what's safe to feel connected to other people. And so certainly the psychological effects of quarantine, I'm sure that on the other side, and I think right now there's probably research studies that are getting up and running to look at this, but this is going to be, the social piece, I think, is going to be particularly, and already is, challenging for a lot of folks. So I'm thankful for technology, like, even what you and I are able to do here today, because I think that helps facilitate a sense of connectedness with other people. And, I think I've been thinking often about folks who live alone, and even just the absence of touch, of human touch. I mean, there's studies looking at infants who, it's called failure to thrive, where if you don't get that nurture and love, infants will actually die. I mean, that's how powerful and important social connection is and nurturing is for us. So this is big stuff here that we're talking about. And so I think, as many different ways as people can find ways to be connected to folks in their life, from colleagues to friends to family, it's really, really important to do. I know the internet, connecting virtually doesn't feel sufficient by any means. And yet, if it can help kind of get folks through this tough time, then that's a beautiful thing.
So something that just occurred to me is, I was kind of thinking through what the after effects of isolation is going to be. We've said depression a few times, and I know anxiety, people generally know what that means. But depression, I'm not sure if everyone does have an idea of what we mean when we talk about a clinical depression.
Sure.
Can you kind of give just the highlights or the lowlights of what depression looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. So One thing that I'll say is that, again, kind of depending on who you are, you might experience depression, a little bit differently from the person next to you who's also depressed. And there's also, again, talking about range of symptom severity. There are folks who can have extreme debilitating depression, and then some who experience what we would think of as sub-threshold or kind of ebbing and flowing of some mood issues, but it doesn't necessarily get to the point where they can't function in their life. But when we're talking about clinical depression, we're generally talking about someone who experiences for more than 2 weeks, experiences a mood that is, persistently down, depressed. They may be tearful, they may be irritable. Also, another big one with depression is a lack of interest or pleasure in activities that someone used to find enjoyable. So those are kind of, when we think of depression, those are like the two main things that often pop up for folks. And then, of course, there are all kinds of other things. So weight loss and weight gain due to appetite changes, sleep disturbance, difficulties concentrating, feelings of worthlessness, guilt, and then also, of course, suicide is something, thoughts of suicide, and actually, pursuing a suicide attempt is something else that we can also see with depression.
And are there physical responses too, like just a desire to not move? Is that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So also it can look physical. So sometimes people will actually feel like they're more fidgety and restless and maybe be more kind of, more restless than they are usually. Other times we see a slowing. The psych jargony term for it is psychomotor retardation. That's the word. And so, you may notice, if you've ever seen someone who's like this, you may notice that they speak much more slowly. Their mood is very, very, there's like a stillness quality, like a numbness. Sometimes that's how people also experience depression, is just, they don't feel happy, they don't feel sad, they just really don't feel anything at all.
For people that do have some mental health issues that they've known about and they've looked at, is the isolation they experience, is it more acute, or is there a chance it's less? And I actually, I'm going to throw this on you at the last minute, because one of the things that I think is really interesting, and I've talked to a lot of colleagues who were open about mental health and asked them, how they're doing, just checking in on them. And a lot of them responded, actually, I'm doing pretty well. It's like, I've been training for this my whole life. It's like, I have the tools. Is it the case that people that have kind of gone down this journey might be better equipped, or is it the case that people that have a more natural inclination towards depression, anxiety, psychotic issues, anything we're talking about, are they magnified in the light of what's been going on, or both?
I think it's likely a both and kind of situation. I do think that there's something to be said for folks who have pre-existing mental health conditions, whether they've been formally diagnosed or not. But, for folks who have been in therapy, doing some work, gaining some understanding about their experiences, as well as skills and tools to help them cope with it, they may actually be finding that they are doing pretty great through this compared to folks who have maybe never experienced mental health concerns before, or who have no experience in treatment. So I do think that, and I think it's also important to acknowledge that for folks who are or who do have any kind of mental health issue, they may also notice that this is a much more triggering time. So they may feel more activated than they usually do. Their symptoms may creep in more intensely than they usually do. And, I think to that end too, if the symptoms are more intense, then it can also make it more difficult to cope.
That makes perfect sense. I'm thinking about the coping, and going back to when you mentioned grief before. And nostalgia, I think, has this piece of loss and grief built into it. What does loss look like from a mental health perspective, and how could that be playing out with everything we're going through right now?
Yeah, I think, people experience loss in different ways. If we're talking about the traditional stages of grief, I'm thinking about David Kessler, who again, wrote that article or was featured in that article. And then also, the big name in grief research is Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and those stages of grief from denial to anger to bargaining to acceptance to meaning making. I mean, these are, first of all, grief is not experienced linearly by any means. So there's no right way to go through grief. There's no right way to feel loss. People can feel loss because of a variety of different things, like you were saying, whether it's that you are feeling sad because understandably so, you were upset that you weren't able to share Passover or Easter or another holiday with your family as you usually do. Whether you feel angry because you can't go to graduation and have that kind of public celebration, that rite of passage, in the way that we are so ingrained to think that we get to go through that. Again, I think what grief looks like for any one individual is going to vary, but I think it often can come with feelings of sadness, anger, those kind of traditional like stages of grief, if you will. One thing that I do think is so important is that just really highlighting the message that it is okay to feel. Of course, if you are in a situation that's unsafe, I mean, when it's like what we talk about with veterans who I was working with in the PTSD clinic, you couldn't feel fear and sadness when you were in the middle of a war zone. There was no space to do that. You were doing exactly what you needed to do, which was focus on survival, getting you through. And on the other side of things, when you are in a space where you're safe, how can you create room to feel those emotions? Because now it's safe to do so. And so, again, it's going to vary depending on folks' respective situations. But when you are, I guess my thought would be, when you are in a space where it is safe to feel the anger, the sadness, the worry, the frustration, whatever it is, that to do it, because you're human. We're all human. We're all going through this together, and not avoiding those emotions, I think, ultimately will serve people better on the other side of this pandemic. I
want to amplify that message. The idea, because I know this is something that's hard for me. The idea that we feel how we feel, and that's okay. It's not something we need to fight against. That's not something we need. Obviously, it can get to a point that we might want to look to get help. But in general, it's being gentle with ourselves and saying, no, like I'm angry, and that's okay that I'm angry. Like,
right.
Sorry, go ahead.
Oh yeah, no, I was just gonna totally agree with you that, right, it's okay to be angry. It's okay to feel frustrated. It's okay to feel scared. These are very scary times for a lot of people. There's a lot of uncertainty. And if there's one thing that we humans like a lot, it's stability and certainty. So we are right now faced with an enormous amount of unknowing. And so feeling what comes up in that space, I think is of course, it's normal. That's normal to feel.
So less than push more on the fear idea. And one of the things that I hadn't planned on explicitly asking you, and it might be unfair to explicitly ask
That's fine.
a practicing clinician this question, but I'm going to anyway, is one, what are the effects of being in this perpetual state of fear? And then the other one, and it's kind of aligned with the leaning into how you're feeling, at what point is it too much? And that's the part that it's not fair that I'm asking you. So in other words, the idea that, okay, I'm afraid, well, that's fine, and I should honor that, and I should, respect the fact I'm afraid. But if I'm in a constant state of fear, is there a point that's like, well, that might be excessive, that might be rumination happening?
Right. I think that's those are two important things to disentangle. So I'll see if I can disentangle them as best as I can.
Sorry again.
That's totally okay. So when we think about being in a perpetual state of fear, like if we even take a step back from that, when someone is in an acute place of stress, as in, a bear walks into your campsite, for example, your body is going to release a flood of neurotransmitters, from cortisol to norepinephrine to adrenaline. You will stop, your digestion will stop, your pupils will dilate, you will stop, your blood flow will change, and it will focus more on the kind of core internal organs. So people who are very stressed during an acute stressor may notice like their hands get very, very cold. And there's a reason why, again, that is your body doing exactly what it should be doing, which is doing everything that it needs to do to try to keep you alive. So you'll get tunnel vision, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, short term, that kind of stress is not a problem, because once the stressor's over, then, you know, anecdotally, we talk about like, oh, I just had an adrenaline dump, right? And so then your body does what it does to come back to its natural resting state, and you resume a place of equilibrium. Now, when we talk about chronic stress or a prolonged state of fear specifically, then what we are talking about is a body that gets very, very amped up as if it's going into survival mode, or it is going into survival mode, but then it doesn't have that nice kind of rebalancing and what's the word I'm looking for? Like, yeah, I guess like becoming more rebalanced, so to speak. And so there isn't that discharge that happens with acute stress. And so chronic stress over time is associated, I mean, there's so much research on this. It's associated with all kinds of different health issues, from, you know, immunosuppression to cardiovascular disease to, you know, it's of course associated with mental illness. For women, it's associated with changes to their menstrual cycle. I mean, on and on I could go. I mean, the human body just isn't well designed to be in a perpetual state of fear.
Is there anything kind of common tells that you know that you recognize that if someone is displaying them, that they might be in this point of, you know, constant fear arousal and having trouble kind of fleshing out the adrenaline?
Yeah, there are lots of different ways that you might, you know, whether you are an individual just kind of reflecting on this for yourself, or you are someone who is concerned about a family member. There are lots of different things that you might notice or look for. I mean, one would be someone who, if we're thinking about from the thought perspective, someone who is just ruminating, thinking over and over and over again about what's coming out on the news. I mean, certainly there's no shortage of things on the news right now that could keep someone in a state of pretty, you know, perpetual stress or fear or worry. So someone who's just constantly going on and on and on in their head about the current state of the world and how worried they are. You also, I don't know if you've ever been in the room with someone, but we talk about this a lot as mental health clinicians, that we can actually feel, you can feel the energy in the room when someone comes in a very heightened stress. You might feel this kind of tense nervousness. You know, I know for me that if I'm in the room with someone who's very stressed, I actually will, and it's totally out of my control, I'll mirror it. So I will become I'll notice a tension in my chest. I'll notice that I start to feel more anxious and jittery than I usually do. And
I'll start curling up myself. Like, I know exactly what you're talking about. Like, my legs will start crossing. I'll start hunching over.
So if you're in the room with someone and all of a sudden you notice, wow, why am I starting to hunch over like this? That may actually be that your body is picking up on something that your brain can't even fully articulate yet about what's happening in the room with the person you're with. So I think those are some kind of common things that you can look out for. And of course, you know, how someone's mood. Are they crying and tearful all the time? Are they kind of numb and zoned out? I mean, again, I think what we're looking for is, if we're talking specific about COVID-19 and what's going on now, are you noticing that there's been an abrupt change in yourself or in someone else? And that's maybe, you know, when you really want to kind of check in and see, how am I doing, or how is that person doing?
So with that, we have laid out an Armageddon scenario of all the different, many different mental health issues. I want to now turn for the rest of the time that I can steal from you on what we can do today at the individual level to try to start or to continue to cope with a lot of what's going on right now in the world, and to cope or how we're feeling, how it's affecting our body, how it's affecting our brains. So assume I've recently started working from home full time. My kids are now with me full time because their school has been canceled for now. What are some of the things that individuals should be looking to do to at least maximize the likelihood that they might get in a good spot for mental health?
Yeah, it's again, another really great and timely question. First of all, I have the utmost respect and admiration for any family that is navigating an abrupt transition to working from home along with childcare responsibilities, especially folks who have little ones who require, near constant or constant attention. I mean, I really, again, families, I think, are doing the absolute best that they can given the circumstances. And, it's like, whatever you got to do to make it work, like, do that, because that's, these are stressors that most people have never experienced quite in this way before. So I just wanted to throw that out there up front too, because I think that's,
I actually agree. It's important as part of that, being gentle with yourself.
Yes.
You need to recognize how difficult the situation is.
Right. Like, this is not a normal situation. So being very gentle and tender with yourself, that there is no template for this. People are figuring it out as they go, and there are all kinds of unknowns. And I would hope, and I think, we'll talk more about this next time, but would also hope that workplaces are doing what they can on their end to really support these kind of, jarring accommodations that people are needing, especially those who have kids at home or who are in housing situations that just aren't conducive to being able to do the work that they usually do. So anyway, I digress, but back to your original question about how can people cope. When I think about coping, when I talk about coping with patients, one of the things that I try to really put in the limelight is that it's important to take a holistic approach to coping. So this means doing things that nurture your mind, your body, your spirit, your soul, your taste buds, your playfulness, your hobbies and passions, your relationships, really taking this big picture approach to coping with current stress. And I think, that's also very timely now. Now, granted, what people do to cope may look different, because it's not as easy to just go to the gym like people did before. I mean, all the gyms are closed. So getting creative about, well, how do you get that physical movement that you're maybe used to having? Is it that you are doing crunches on your living room floor or whatever it is, but finding ways that you can kind of get at these different aspects of your life, because we all have different parts of ourselves that want and need different things. So figuring out, again, for each person, that's going to look a little bit different, although there may be commonalities, of course, but figuring out what is it that nurtures you in these different aspects of your life. And then how can you, on any given day, find a way to connect with that part of yourself.
How important, you mentioned the physical piece, how important is the physical piece when we're talking about mental health?
Yeah, I mean, there's a ton of research out there about the benefits of exercise and endorphins. And so, I think, again, people are probably, and myself included, I'm living a far more sedentary lifestyle right now than I've ever lived before, I think, which, I can partially attribute to my able-bodiedness and my ability to move around the world pretty freely when we're not in the current situation that we are in. But yeah, physical movement is absolutely important. So, again, whether that's that you're running up and down a set of stairs, or you're doing crunches, or you are just walking, making a point to walk around your living space, whatever it is, once an hour for 5 minutes, even if it means you walk in a circle 20 times, just anything to get a little bit of blood flow and movement. I think it also helps those emotions and those worries move through us energetically in a way that, otherwise we're just kind of sitting, kind of balled up with it all.
How do you, and this could be a very personalized question where there isn't a general answer. That wouldn't be the first one I asked of you today, but I'll give you the out there again. For people who have a natural resistance to what you said, and in particular something that looks like, well, I'd love to do that, but I don't have the luxury. I have a job, I have kids, I have to cook, I have to do this, which is a very natural resistance to being able to be gentle with yourself and take time for yourself. Do you have any, I don't know if standard is the right word, a kind of guidance for that kind of pushback?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, these are very, very real things that people are grappling with and facing right now. So again, I think that speaks to the importance of figuring out what it is that's going to work for you. So for some people, that might mean that it's, once a day, I spend a minute where I just practice that kind of slow diaphragmatic breathing. It's 1 minute. and that's all I can do. And you know what? That 1 minute is better than no minutes. So again, I think it is important to figure out, you can't just adopt someone else's coping plan and say, okay, this is what I'm going to do and I'll be fine. It is really about figuring out what's going to work for you and recognizing that that's going to look different depending on who you are.
Okay, so now let me ask you an even more unfair question. So assume someone's watched this and they started thinking, oh, you know what? Yeah, there has been a change. And, if I'm more snippy at people now, if I have just, had less desire to do things, maybe I should start focusing on this. And let's say they do start thinking about things that should help with their mental health, whether it's, eating better with the physical piece and actually having the physical movement, whether it's just taking time for themselves, whether it's meditating, whether it's doing something they love. How long do they start feeling that kind of reset normal?
Oh my gosh, I wish that there was a straightforward answer that I could give you. I mean, I think again, this kind of speaks to something that I mentioned earlier, which is just that we humans we crave stability, we crave predictability, we want certainty, we want to know with clarity how long until I'm going to feel X, Y, or Z. And unfortunately, right now, there is just no straightforward answer to that. And, again, I think that doesn't mean don't keep doing these things that are helping you navigate through and tread, even if it's just treading water and keeping your head above water through what we're going through right now. Keep doing it.
And one of the reasons I wanted to ask that is in the, people feeling compassion for themselves, recognizing that you can do everything right and there's still going to be up days and down days.
Exactly.
And it doesn't mean you're doing things wrong. It just means the likelihood that an update will come soon is increased.
Yes. And I also think that there's something very powerful about, even though it can feel hard to really take it in, reminding yourself that what we are going through right now is temporary. It will not last forever. And that while there are a number of things that are outside of any one of our controls, there are things, small things that we can do every day to nurture our well-being. And also, I think what you're talking about too, that self-compassion, which is for many of us, myself included, that is always a work in progress because it is not easy to be gentle with ourselves. Nope.
No, it's not. So I think we talked a lot about people that now just have all this coming at them. I would imagine there's a whole maybe the same but maybe amplified, maybe not, set of challenges with someone who maybe lost their job and now what they're facing is fear added to a lot of free time. Is there any nuance to that people would want to look out for?
I guess what's coming to mind for me as you ask that question is just really recognizing that something like losing a job, and for many, many people, the very related financial stress that comes along with that is an enormous, enormous stressor for anyone to go through, let alone to go through it in the middle of a pandemic. And so, again, I think this is where also like hierarchy of needs, people are going to go into doing the things that they need to do to ensure that they can have a roof over their heads and food on their table and that they're able to take care of their families. And so, again, people need to do what they need to do to get through some of these very stressful situations. And yes, at times that means that you're not able to take care of yourself in the way that you want to. And recognizing that, honoring that, and knowing, okay, I'm going into survival mode. I'm going to do all the things that I need to do right now to try to keep my quality of life as high as I can. And if there are days where I just can't do anything, then okay, it's okay to be gentle with yourself there, because a job loss, which millions of folks are going through, is an enormous, enormous source of stress. So I don't want to underestimate that or minimize the impact of that on any one person's mental health.
I know one of the challenges I have when there are very specific times that I do go into survival mode and know that I'm going into survival mode and actually make a conscious choice to go into survival mode. I know for me, one of the challenges is how I phrased it before is I've dipped my toe back into the anxiety waters, and next thing I know, I was 10 feet under the water looking up and going, well, how the heck did that happen? And one of the challenges for me is once going into survival mode, now it's just the adrenaline rush and it's just living. it's hard for me to kind of get some space for myself to say, okay, Jay, it's time to get out of survival mode. Is there any guidance on what that can look like, or is that where it just does help to have someone helping you that's not you?
Yeah, I think what you're getting at is maybe a kind of set of coping strategies that people can use that are, at least again in kind of the mental health lingo, we call it grounding strategies. So recognizing that sometimes anxiety can run so high that well, for some folks it's actually experienced as just full-blown panic, but really being able to draw on what are some ways that you can become more grounded in the present moment, because anxiety is going to take you way into the future and depression is often taking you way into the past. And so finding ways to stay in the present. So there are some very, very tangible things that folks can do when they feel this way. I mean, one of the things, of course, is what I had mentioned just briefly earlier around diaphragmatic breathing. So connecting with your breath. There are all
Really
kinds.
quick, if I can jump in, can you give the 10 or 20-second definition of what that is?
Yes. Okay. So diaphragmatic breathing, I actually love talking about breathing because most of, what a concept. So most of the time we go through our days and we're doing what we call chest breathing, which means that it's really easy to tell if you're doing this. So if you put like one hand on your chest and one hand on your stomach and you breathe, whichever hand moves is the kind of breathing that you're doing. So most of the time you'll see that people's like shoulders go up to their ears as they take a breath in, and there's no movement in their stomach at all whatsoever. And so diaphragmatic breathing is really consciously and intentionally bringing air all the way into your diaphragm, so deep into your belly. I often describe it to patients as you can imagine that your belly is like a balloon filling up with air. And so you're really pushing that air all the way down into your belly and doing it slowly, and then also exhaling in kind of the same way. And so that's a way immediately to, in some ways, it's kind of like you're tricking your brain into the parasympathetic response, which is that rest and relaxation. So actually, that's a very, very, very powerful tool that anyone can use. And there are all kinds of guided exercises now out there with different, whether it's Headspace or Insight Timer, there's so many different apps out there now that can actually help teach folks that skill of diaphragmatic breathing.
So one thing that I found interesting with mental health that is actually similar to the pandemic is that if you do everything right, it seems like you overreacted. That with the pandemic, if you do everything right, no one got sick. And so, hey, you shouldn't have done everything you did. And I have the sense that mental health is the same way. I know I've fallen into this trick a lot where I go, well, I feel good, I don't need to exercise today. Or I feel good, I can eat, 2 pounds of Taco Bell today. That seems good. And then, very quickly it's like, oh no, wait, that's actually why I was feeling good. Is that right? That in some ways it's kind of the curse of feeling good, is that it can kind of trick you into thinking you didn't need to do the things that we know work for mental health?
Sure. I mean, I think for some people, absolutely. I mean, when things are going well, it can be easy to say, I'm going to, eat whatever I want, or I don't need to exercise it. I mean, exactly what you described. And when we talk about mental health, I mean, I like to think of it as it's not stopping, it's not starting, it's just an ongoing, like becoming, it's an ongoing maintaining. If you're lucky enough to have really good mental health through good times and bad, then what we're talking about is just an ongoing maintaining of that mental health. And so that's going to continue to require, dedicating time and energy into doing the things that are fulfilling, that help you feel grounded and present in whatever moment that you're in, that helps you feel connected with people around you, that helps you feel connected with yourself. And so I do think there can be this, I'm thinking about actually a lot of the work, especially later on down the line, that I was doing with PTSD and with folks with PTSD, was around this idea of recovery, and how we're often socialized to think that recovery is just this linear, goes straight up. The second I start treatment, it's just going to be all uphill from there, and I'm going to be feeling better. And then, okay, I can, wash my hands of it and I don't have to think about PTSD anymore. And in reality, recovery is far more messy. I mean, it's looking like that. And it requires ongoing attention and care. And so that there's really, I think, a shift in the way that we think about not just recovering or coping with mental health and mental health issues, but also then maintaining that even when things are going great.
And I know for me, part of that has been just the language of not thinking of it in terms of broken and fixed. Because
Yes.
my brain will always be changed. That's one of the things that's been so astounding for me, is even having been through years of therapy and thinking I kind of have a handle on things. Every day my brain changes. And every day, every time I check in with my therapist, it's like, oh, wait, huh? How did that start happening? It is now in some ways a journey of a lifetime, but not, it's not a struggle of a lifetime per se. It's just doing the things that I know get me in a better space.
Yeah, I think you're really spot on there, and I think it's important to name as well.
I told you before how excited I was about this, like talking with you about mental health. Like you can bring it to a level that is so accessible that I always enjoy it. And the fact that you're willing to do this, I cannot thank you enough. Seriously, thank you so much. Thank you for the work you're doing, especially with some of our first responders. I just can't thank you enough.
Oh, you're so welcome. It's been such a pleasure.